Hello everyone, this is Amelia Mills, and this is a voiceover to accompany the slides for the presentation Incorporating Diversity into the Modern Music Classroom. So let's begin. If you'll turn to slide 2, you'll see why do we need more diversity in school music. Basically, we're not serving our student population effectively. Traditional music classes weren't really formulated with all students in mind. What we would call a traditional music curriculum is really just a music curriculum that's Western-centric, which means white-centric, male-centric, ability-centric. It's really just created for the privileged classes, and it's thought of something that people of a higher socioeconomic status typically are involved in. Aspects of traditional music classroom are really rooted in racism, and this includes things like repertoire, and especially children's songs or low-level band repertoire is where it's most apparent, because this could include minstrel tunes or simplified and stereotyped and really westernized representations of the music from other cultures. Moreover, there is also just inadequate representation for a variety of cultures, like inadequate accurate representation mostly. So it's the accuracy here. It's really geared toward a tokenized representation that only leads to perpetuating the idea that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's idea of the single story. So one westernized and inaccurate version of a culture that our youth kind of like learn and internalize and then will pass on. So if you'll see on the slide, all of these songs listed here are actually from the tradition of blackface minstrelsy. So they were written by white people and then performed in blackface to kind of showcase what white people thought black people are like. And if you'll turn to the next slide, even more so, look at this representation. The lack of representation is astounding, because when you search for composers on Google, all of these dead white guys is what comes up. And if you see the second one, it says list of contemporary composers, so meaning composers that are still alive. Even that one still has dead guys on it. So that's a problem. People who are taking music classes really aren't getting all of the representation that we should be getting. So this presentation is just kind of saying, let's not do this anymore. The goal is to change the representation that our students are seeing in their music classes, in terms of both genre and in terms of culture. So, and we're also going to be trying to use this music education as a vehicle for social change. So bringing up different conversations using different parts of the music curriculum. So discussion based around the musical repertoire to help develop a critical consciousness. If you'll turn to slide 4, please. So healing with music education. Another reason that music programs need change is so we can begin the process of student healing through music education. Bettina Love proposed that teachers try to heal and help students become well in Chapter 7 of her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. She pointed out that for many students who have lived through the trauma of routinely encountering social injustice, just being all right and accepting and holding that trauma and stress and internalizing it inside you is really different from being well after you've kind of let go of the pain and the stress and the trauma and you allow yourself to just live. So as you see, there is a quote, "As abolitionists, we must be well. We cannot settle for just being all right. Wellness is a part of social justice work." So as teachers going into this situation, we must already be well, because we can't help our students be well if we have not learned how to be well either. Many communities, organizations, and individuals are already using music as a healing device. So students who are allowed to have an outlet for their trauma and stress are really able to heal better, whether it be through writing or through making music or through creating art. Being able to get your story out there is really quite empowering. And as Bettina Love put it, learn to touch your own spirit, and working on finding an emotional, physical, social, and spiritual outlet for that pain and trauma that students hold with them. So how are we going to do this? How can we teach music with the goal of creating a critical consciousness and with trying to heal and trying to do all these things? So before trying to make any changes to a program, let's keep in mind a couple of things. First of all, what community are you serving? What did the last teacher who was in your position, what did their program look like? And really listen to your students, find out what they might want from their music classes. Now, all of these things are important because you have interviewed to do a particular job, and your employer has certain expectations from you to do what they hired you to do. But you can do it as an abolitionist teacher. So, allowing yourself to get to know the community, and the community here is meaning like students, parents, local businesses, annual events, all those kinds of things, and also letting the students get to know you as a person before you decide to go and change everything that they know too drastically. People kind of like what they know, and if you change too fast, all of a sudden the class that you've created is something that some students maybe didn't sign up for, it's not what they wanted, and that could be a real cause for pushback. So go ahead and talk to your students. I know it sounds obvious, but communicating with the community and your students and finding out what they might want from a new program would be really the best thing for trying to build a new program. If there are long-standing traditions in a community within that music program, kind of try to find out what they are and why it's been kept going as a tradition for so long. And part of it is continuing a tradition means you're really accepting the community and trying to be a part of it. So thinking about changes thoroughly before implementing them can also help prevent acts of curricular violence, such as using inappropriate materials like the minstrel song in the last couple slides, or teaching histories of pieces and composers inaccurately or in a way that might trivialize other cultures. Some communities might need certain things or really want certain things. For example, a rural community that's really widespread and maybe the students don't get to see each other during the summer hardly at all, they might have a marching band because that's one of their needs. A marching band would give students a reason to see each other during like the summer, or it gives a reason for such a widespread rural community to kind of come together in all one spot and celebrate art. Some communities might need something different. Like for example, a more urban district might need something that characterizes their city. I'm just going to give an example here with Atlanta, Georgia, because they're one of the capitals of hip-hop among other popular genres like country. But with hip-hop, because they have such a thriving scene there, they might benefit from including a hip-hop course in the school curriculum. Or I guess you could also do it with a country course. Just something that corresponds with what the community is looking for. So let's go to the next slide. So there is risk involved in educating your students as an abolitionist. And this is just something that we have to accept. Another great quote from Bettina Love here: "White privilege allows you to take the risks that dark people cannot take in the fight for educational justice." I know it says like white privilege, but here you could really put in any privileged class, because privilege is just giving you those tools and that ability to fight for less privileged classes. So those of us going into teaching from positions of privilege have more opportunity to use our privilege in a constructive way and to fight for that educational justice. And of course, we may be in positions of privilege in some ways and not in others, but accepting your positionality and your intersectionality and thinking about how it affects your teaching is a big part of teaching of Love's idea of healing and the teacher education gap. Also, accepting the risk of backlash is just going to be a part of abolitionist teaching. Knowing that some teachers can receive backlash from the community, and that could be you, if what they or you are seen as doing is maybe too political or too religious, even if the religion isn't one that you are following. So each of the links on this slide here take you to an article of a teacher who was discriminated against or even fired for attempting to teach in an abolitionist way, or they were accused of pushing an agenda that some parent or parents didn't really want their children learning about. In actually more than half the states in America, it's still legal to fire someone for being gay, including teachers. So that if you are part of the LGBTQ community, coming out to your students, that can be a risk. But yes, being seen as pushing an agenda, this is often applied to pushing a quote-unquote gay agenda, as a teacher is frowned upon, and some parents may react poorly if they hear you're teaching about or even mentioning homosexuality or racial equity or world religions or anything that they see as against what they're trying to teach their children. So this is especially an issue for music, because music, especially old music, it's just religious. And so much current music of pretty much all genres is about social justice, that if we never taught anything that had some sort of bias, there would be nothing left to teach. That's probably true for all subjects, but I just know it's particularly true for music. You can see these comments on the slide here. These comments pertain to a piece that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And these are community backlash reactions from a teacher teaching a song that models a certain kind of prayer chant in Islam, though it is not actually specifically meant to be used in a religious context, which was an important part of the debate on this situation. So there's one more quote that I kind of liked from a Michigan teacher, Scott Craig, who was recently fired for trying to do abolitionist teaching. He said, "Districts will do anything to avoid negative publicity, including throwing their own teachers under the bus." So getting fired, a possibility. But to keep from getting fired immediately, I tried to find a way that we can ease a community into the abolitionist teaching a little more by starting off with material they're more familiar with, and then working towards more difficult topics and discussions. So if you go to the next slide, here's kind of our first step. Take standard repertoire to introduce underrepresented groups in music. When I say standard repertoire here, I just want to clarify, I'm talking about Western classical music. So when most people think of music class, they do primarily think of Western classical music. So unless you were specifically hired for a job that was not Western classical, it's a pretty safe place to start. So using composers and music that students would kind of expect from a music class, but you can use it as a vehicle to discuss other issues like cultural appropriation, or the historical context a composer may have operated under, and how it influenced their writing or repertoire, or how stereotypes may be perpetuated through music. So treat each piece and the discussion with it as valuable, and don't treat pieces by people from underrepresented groups as kind of a token diversity piece. Again, it seems obvious, but I just feel like I need to say it. Also, be very intentional with the repertoire that you choose for your ensemble, so these discussions will be possible. So I chose 3 pieces to kind of flesh out as examples of the discussions you could have, and each of these is considered a standard in its own repertoire for band, orchestra, and choir, respectively. So the first one we're going to talk about on the next slide is variations on a Korean folk song. So I've included 3 different versions of this piece if you would like to listen to them. The first one is Chance's, John Barnes Chance, who wrote this piece. It's his arrangement of it, performed by George Mason University's Wind Symphony. The second one is a version of the actual folk song it's based on, called Arirang, performed by the K-pop group BTS. And the third version is Arirang performed on traditional Korean folk instruments. So really there are basically thousands of variations and different dialects and different lyrics based on region, but the general kind of message of this piece is about the difficulties of leaving a loved one. And just a little background on the piece, it has been around for about 600 years, but it grew in popularity during the 20th century in Korea. It was first used as a resistance song during Japan's colonial rule over Korea from about 1910 to 1945, and it grew to become an anthem representing the 1945 split of the peninsula. So John Barnes Chance originally heard this song while he was serving for the US Army while he was stationed in Korea. So he heard this piece, thought, this is pretty neat. I think this is a fun tune. And so he remembered it, took it back to the United States, and decided that he would write and publish a piece. So he did. A little bit of discussion you could have on that is, do you think it was okay for him to write this piece? He wasn't Korean, he didn't really know the significance of the piece when he heard it. He basically just thought it was kind of fun. So would we consider it stealing? Would we consider it cultural appropriation? Or is it okay and he's just trying to kind of share world culture with American audiences? Do you think you would feel different about it if he had not come across the song during a wartime, but instead like on a vacation or a tour of Korea? And finally, what do we think of this kind of westernized version of Eastern music? Because while it is an Eastern song, John Barnes Chance has taken it and turned it into a Western classical piece. So he's using Western classical instruments and instrumentation, and he's using Western classical form in his music, which is going to be different. So basically, having discussions like these helps kind of introduce the concept and build vocabulary on things like cultural appropriation, and helps them to use what they now know to recognize those concepts in other places. It also gives vocabulary, gives students vocabulary to speak out against injustice, and provides a safe place to learn and discuss these kinds of topics. Slide 9. So this one is selections from West Side Story by Leonard Bernstein. So this selection includes the songs I Feel Pretty, Maria, Something's Coming, Tonight, and other songs from the musical West Side Story, the score for which was composed by Leonard Bernstein. He wrote a lot of pieces, but I chose an arrangement because West Side Story is so popular for band and orchestra teachers to choose as repertoire, not only because of it has such recognizable melodies, but also because playing Bernstein is kind of seen as a must for students, because he was just so influential as an American composer. And it's a very realistic option, because arrangements of Bernstein's music exist for all levels of musicians, and it's a great opportunity to talk about how identities might affect a composer. Bernstein was considered one of the greatest American composers and conductors to ever really live. He was the son of 2 Ukrainian immigrants, he was of Jewish heritage, and he was gay. So thinking about how these types of things might have affected his career and personal life is a good idea, especially as it was beginning after he graduated college in 1939, which was right at the start of World War II, when both Jews and gay people were facing such opposition in Europe from the Nazis, such horrible, horrible discrimination and death. So just thinking about those things, you can talk a little bit about that with your students, and you can also talk about the musical itself. West Side Story was a story about the conflict between a white gang, the Jets, and a Puerto Rican gang, the Sharks, when a member of the Jets falls in love with the sister of a member of the Sharks. This was actually based off of Romeo and Juliet, so it's the same sort of principle. So you can talk with your students, do the events in West Side Story still seem relevant to today? Is there anything we can really take away from the story as a society now, as opposed to when it was supposed to be set, kind of in the 1960s? And also, how do you think he felt as a gay composer writing the music to what became such a prominent but straight love story? So those are some of the things you can think about with West Side Story. So go to the next slide. We're going to be talking about this piece for choir called Shosholoza. This is a very popular song for choir classes currently because it's repetitive and pretty easy to follow the melody, and it's really uplifting, has an uplifting feel to it. But it's a good example because it's an opportunity to discuss the importance of respect and context when singing songs from other cultures, especially songs in other languages. So, when singing songs in other languages, obviously make sure all of the pronunciation is accurate. So we make sure we're honoring a culture rather than kind of butchering its art. Also, respecting the context of the song is very important. This song in particular was first sung by workers from Zimbabwe who traveled by train between Zimbabwe and South Africa to work in risky and very dangerous gold and diamond mines. This song was supposedly helped them keep their spirits up while they were working, and helped give them a rhythm to kind of swing their tools to. So it's a pretty serious context that it's coming out of originally, and even more so, it was also a big part and a big symbol that was kind of reappropriated to fight apartheid in South Africa. And even Nelson Mandela really saw it as a huge symbol of freedom, and it's been adopted as South Africa's kind of second national anthem. So it's a really, really, really important song to South African tradition. So Shosholoza basically means to go forward and to kind of strive. So it's a really great message to have in a song that's going to be representing a country. So the two recordings I've included, one is a choir performance by an esteemed South African boys choir, and the other one is from a large crowd of fans at a soccer game in South Africa. So from these examples, you can see this song is so well known in South Africa that you can hear just regular old soccer fans kind of harmonizing and singing two different lines. So that's just seeing how important it is to South African culture. So that's something that you can definitely talk about with your students, and making sure that your students aren't mocking any of it or mispronouncing the language or performing it with no knowledge of what it actually means, because that really just takes the importance right out of it. If we'll move to the next slide, here's the second step. We can begin to include contemporary pieces about a variety of culturally relevant topics into the repertoire. So to be absolutely clear, when I say contemporary, I'm talking about music that's written by composers who are still alive. So choosing composers who have been trained and write in classical, Western classical music style, writing still for band, choir, orchestra, that kind of thing, but they choose more provoking topics or topics that are very important to them. And these are messages that are kind of sent by the composers, and they're often very personal things that the composers have connected to, and they're trying to send a very strong message through their music. And this is also a great way to add representation to repertoire and support current artists of color, LGBTQ artists, women and trans artists, artists of a variety of religions, ethnicities, pretty much anything. Especially because there are more women and more like out LGBTQ artists and artists of color, because those walls are starting to come down on the whole, dead white guys. It's not perfect yet, but it's starting. So making sure we support those artists is an important thing in abolitionist teaching. If it's possible, it would be great to have students be able to communicate directly with composers of the pieces, of whose pieces like they're playing or singing. So you could write letters or emails to these composers, or if your school has funding enough to do this, you could commission from local artists or have artists come and visit to talk with the students. But if none of that is possible, you can always just visit the artist's website, because most current active artists will have a website. Or you could visit their social media page and explore what kind of messages they're trying to send with their music. If we can go to the next slide, we'll start in with some examples. So this piece is called Zikr, and it's by Allah Raka Rehman. This particular recording that is on the slide is by the National Taiwan University Chorus. It's a really excellent recording. So Allah Raka Rehman is an Indian and a Muslim contemporary composer. He has mostly been involved in writing movie scores. His most famous ones have been for Slumdog Millionaire and for the movie 127 Hours. But he's become so accomplished in India as a cinema composer that he was even nicknamed the Mozart of Madras. Anyways, this piece is for choir, obviously, and choir programs tend to sing a lot of gospel or masses or general like Catholic or Protestant type religious music. But they don't sing as much music that represents other religions. So including this can help add more representation for both, Indian artists and Islamic artists, Islamic music. But it is important to note that this piece is not actually meant to be used in worship. It was actually written for the documentary The Forgotten Hero, and it's a good representation of music that is in Sufi prayer kind of chant style. So by programming this kind of music can lead to class discussions about other religions, other religious music styles, similarities, differences to the Catholic and Protestant style that high school choir students are more familiar with. So if you go back to slide 6, you'll see those comments I mentioned earlier. Those comments were about a high school choir teacher who had programmed this piece, but had received a lot of backlash from her community for using it in her classroom. And one student actually quit the choir because he didn't feel comfortable, is what he said, singing this song. So if you want to read the article, I've linked it at the bottom of the slide, and along with that article, you can read all the comments that are on it. There's quite a few of them, and some people are for, some people are against, but it's an interesting read. If you see on the next slide, we have our next example. The piece is A Mother of a Revolution by Omar Thomas. So Omar Thomas is a Black gay composer, very accomplished. He's currently serving as Associate Professor of Harmony at Berklee College of Music and Assistant Professor of Music Theory at the Peabody Conservatory. Most of the writing he's done so far has been for wind ensemble or for big band jazz ensemble. This particular piece is for wind ensemble. This piece is about Marsha P. Johnson, who was a Black trans woman who helped lead the fight for LGBTQ rights during the Stonewall riots of 1969. During those riots, police officers raided a gay club called the Stonewall Inn, and this had sparked riots and 6 days of protesting. So this was a very important event. Thomas's website says that this piece intends to honor the LGBTQ community and its connection to club culture, as clubs can be an important place of freedom and self-expression. And this piece not only offers representation to Black students and gay students and trans students, but can also provoke conversations about gay and trans rights and intersectionality of identities and even maybe police brutality. And you can think about what has changed since the 1960s in terms of all of these things, if anything has changed. For the better, for worse. On the next slide, we'll have our last example for this section. The piece, The Eyes of the World Are Upon You. This was written by Jennifer Jolie, another very accomplished composer. She is a white woman who serves on the composition faculty at Texas Tech School of Music. She writes a really wide variety of music, including band and choir, orchestra, chamber music, and actually a lot of her music includes electronic parts too, which is really cool. So this particular piece that she's written is a band piece, and it's about the first school mass campus shooting in 1966 at UT Austin. And she wrote this piece as a response to Texas lawmakers passing a bill that allows students and faculty to conceal carry handguns in, quote, classrooms, dormitories, and other buildings, end quote. So school shootings are obviously a very serious and heavy topic, but it is one that's really close to the hearts of many high school students who see school shootings reported on the news and social media, and maybe some of them have even experienced shootings. So really the important thing about this is to keep in mind that while it is a heavy topic, your students can handle it. Your students know. There's nothing that you can really protect them from on this topic. And by playing a topic that's going to be so close to them, it allows them to kind of open up emotionally and allow themselves to be kind of vulnerable with a topic like this. And of course, you can have lots of discussions about how we can prevent school shootings or why do they happen. But Jolie represents very strong women composers, as well as other issues besides school shootings, such as climate change, wildfires, racism, and other sometimes difficult and often political topics in her other music. So if you would like to check out her music, I highly encourage it. Alright, so now we can start getting into the last section here, which is part 3, exploring authentic music from a variety of cultures and identities, and how their styles or messages kind of tie into the experience of a culture. So this is where tailoring curriculum to your students is going to be probably the most important out of the 3 steps. Being aware that the musical traditions of the people in the school can help you build a new program that addresses the needs of for a culturally relevant music experience. So these classes are going to be for kids who wouldn't normally be interested in music. They're not interested in the large ensemble type class. It's not for them. So the intention here is to just broaden the idea of what a high school music class can be. It can really be anything as long as it has something that the students can engage with and connect with on a personal and cultural level, and of course it involves music. So something that is going to be important, yes, every step of the way, but also especially here, is being aware of your positionality relative to the material you are teaching. Kind of taking stock of, is this material a part of your own culture? If not, what can you do to learn more about it alongside your students? What can you do to make sure that you're teaching authentically? Are there any community resources, including performances or local artists that you could use to give the kids an artistic model that they can connect to personally? And as always, be aware of your students' own cultural capital. If this music is a part of their culture but it's not a part of yours, they likely have a lot of information that you don't and that they can contribute and share with the rest of the class and share with you, and you can learn just as much as they're learning. So what I've been told from current teachers in the field, whenever I go and interact with teachers who are teaching in this kind of way, and they're teaching music from a culture that isn't theirs, the advice that I get almost every time has been to just do some research and then you just have to get in there and do it. They say that you'll never really be prepared to teach music from a culture that's not your own. So it's about getting in there and experimenting a little to see what works for your classroom and your students, what works, what doesn't work, if there's anything else that they want from the class that you're not giving them. So some examples of classes that you could have. Of course, have a beat making class or a hip hop class using simple, accessible websites. This is not, of course, a new idea. In fact, Bettina Love, as I mentioned earlier, she is a big supporter of this topic. But this slide is just to kind of frame it in terms of how we can do it as a music class. So up at the top here, you can see I've included 2 links for free and easy to use websites. Incredibox is going to be more appropriate for an elementary level class. Loop Labs is going to be a better option for a middle school or maybe a high school setting. If funding isn't an issue, then I would encourage more advanced beat making software that you can buy. A lot of websites have subscriptions that you can purchase for student use, but this class could basically go a lot of different ways. You could focus on analysis of current rap and the history of it. So you could think about different genres, or you could focus on performance and do covers of existing songs. Or you could go for more of a composing style class where students are mostly working on mixing tracks and writing their own verses. But all of these things on here are things you could discuss with a composing class. You could think about different instruments and techniques used in hip hop, loops, synthetic or electronic instruments, beatboxing, more formal aspects like sampling and different flows, different rhythms, rhyme schemes. Or for performance aspects, you can talk about things like stage presence and cultivating a persona as a performer and discussing performance anxiety. So get your students to collaborate with each other, perform for each other in the classroom, or if they wanted to have a public performance, that would be something that you could talk about with your students and set up together. The next slide is going to have an example for jazz bands. So again, pretty obvious choice. Many schools in America already have a jazz band, but it's more about the way that you're framing this class that makes all the difference. You can hold discussions with students about the beginnings of jazz history, the roles of historical Black entertainers from the beginnings of jazz through today. You could discuss influential jazz artists, the different genres of jazz, and what or who influenced each different genre, who is kind of the pioneer, the champion of that different genre. Jazz bands also teach a lot of great musical skills, such as improvisation, oral skills, group musicianship, and rhythm skills. So there's a lot that you can get out of it, both as an abolitionist teacher and as a music teacher. So for the last example here, you could try having a pop or rock music course. So you may think here, oh, we can't really do that. How are we going to get guitars? But the thing is, you don't need guitars really to have a pop or rock music ensemble. It can really work with all kinds of instruments. You could have guitars, sure. You could also have ukuleles, which are cheaper and often more accessible to young students. You could have keyboards, computer music, or even traditional band instruments. So first you can introduce a little bit of music theory, including like basic chord progressions, basic form, and then from there, students can kind of pick their groups and either maybe write their own music. They can write their own music if they want, or they can choose to transcribe a known pop song or rock song. And this might sound difficult, but we already know that students can do this because they're already doing it. If you have ever been in a middle school or high school band room before or after a rehearsal where kids are just kind of goofing around on their instruments, some little saxophone kid is going to be like wailing on that riff from Careless Whisper, or Talk Dirty to Me, or Thrift Shop, or any number of catchy like saxophone little lines. So that's just students using their oral skills. We can take that ability and use it in a constructive and organized way to make a pop or rock music course. So allowing students to have this time to just rehearse and perform with and for each other. And through this, you can also have discussions with your students about current and past like pop or rock music artists. How has their music influenced others? Have certain artists used their music as a social justice tool? And are there any issues that you think need to be addressed in the pop music industry today? All right, slide 19 is going to talk about something not so fun, but very necessary, funding. So funding in the arts is a problem for a lot of schools. We know this. This is not news to anybody. And this is just because schools like to focus on funding tested subjects, so like math and English especially. And when schools are underfunded, the budgets get slashed for the arts. There are fundraising methods, and a lot of music classes today depend on fundraising for more extras like trips or buying new music stands, purchasing new instruments. And this is talking about more the traditional music classroom. But the thing is, fundraising efforts can only go so far. And some lower socioeconomic status school districts really can't rely on community fundraising because the money just isn't there. The best thing you can really do is take advantage of what the school and the students already have. So fixing instruments is going to be cheaper than buying a new one, usually. It depends on how broken the instrument is, but usually there are quick fixes that can be done. And there are plenty of styles that you can do with limited instrumentation. So if you're coming into a program that has been a traditional like band program, there's a lot of things that you can do with that. Some instruments are really versatile. I'm just going to take trumpets as an example here. So trumpets can be used in wind bands, orchestras, brass quintets or brass choirs, jazz, mariachi, pop music. For example, if you think of Hey Look Ma, I Made It by Panic at the Disco, has that great little trumpet line. Or it can be used in rock music, so music by Beatles or by the band Chicago. So the trumpet and the saxophone also are very, very, very versatile instruments. So if you don't have instruments and there isn't any fundraising or funding possible, but you still want to try a new class, there are still other options. So hip hop class is going to be one of your best bets. With hip hop, you can focus on voice percussion. And by voice percussion, I just mean beatboxing. That's pretty much free. There are the free programs online that I linked a couple slides ago. Writing verses doesn't cost anything. You can go on YouTube and search free beats, and there you'll have some examples of beats that you can just take from YouTube and write verses for that. Or if you're trying to study the form and stuff of current artists, you can still access like YouTube or Spotify for free. Or you can try a found percussion class. So found percussion classes don't really require traditional instruments. They just require students to form groups and buy like fairly cheap items, or they can bring items from home. But if this is an unfamiliar concept to you, then please look up the group Stomp. They're a professional found percussion group, and they make these like complex and layered rhythms with everyday items like basketballs or brooms. Is really cool, and it can even combine dance elements as well. So if your students are really needing to get up and kind of move during the day, this is a great opportunity to do that. So again, slide 20, next slide, another not so fun topic, cultural appropriation. So first of all, let's just define it. One definition from a woman named Susan Scafidi. She's a professor at Fordham Law School and an expert in intellectual property law. She has defined cultural appropriation as taking intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, or artifacts from someone else's culture without permission. This can include unauthorized use of another culture's dance, dress, music, language, folklore, cuisine, traditional medicine, and religious symbols. So in historical music, it's been pretty obvious what the cultural appropriation is. So European opera typically in history has cast white opera singers and put them in yellowface or blackface or brownface for different roles. These productions also definitely promoted the single story, as it was a bunch of white people who wrote these stories about other cultures. So these depictions aren't necessarily going to be accurate. They were experienced in a very limited capacity by the white composers and librettists who, created these works. So I've listed several examples on the slide, such as Chinese and Japanese stereotypes, and using yellowface in Turandot, Madame Butterfly, and the Mikado. Exoticization of Muslims in Abduction from the Seraglio, and use of blackface for roles in opera like Othello, Aida, and Cleopatra. Also, blackface minstrelsy was another huge example of historical cultural appropriation. And this was primarily an American thing, where white people would dress up and put on black shoe polish on their faces, and they would imitate their caricatures of how they believed black people looked and acted. And they would sing songs, and they would just put on a show. But they would portray black people, these characters who were kind of foolish and bumbling, and sometimes they actually longed to go back into slavery. not great. The example that I linked in this slide is from an opera by Maurice Ravel, called L'Enfant et les Sortilèges, which is French for The Child and the Spells. And this opera was about a child who kind of abuses his toys and his playthings, and he wakes up one day and they've all come to life, and they don't want to play with him or be his friend or whatever. But this particular production, I believe it was a 1999 production, dresses the teapot character in blackface and an afro, and dresses the China teacup character in bright makeup resembling geisha makeup, which isn't even Chinese, it's Japanese, and puts the teacup in a very elaborate gold and red costume. The teacups song, which is indicated with the time marking that I put below the link, is called Keng Ka Fu Mahjong, and the lyrics are a mix of French and faux Chinese. So these are syllables that are meant to imitate Chinese, or Mandarin, I guess, but it doesn't actually mean anything. So definitely an appropriation of language. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about appropriation and how it's presented today. White pop artists often adopt aspects of Black culture to give them an edge or to help them break away from a more innocent image and adopt a sexual appeal. That is a huge theme of cultural appropriation in pop music today. So this has happened with a lot of artists. So there are some older artists like Kesha appropriating Black fashion and hairstyles, for example, in her music video for Crazy Kids, which I have linked at the bottom. Or there's Post Malone. He's more current, but he uses African American vernacular English, AAVE, as it's also known. He also wears Black fashion and uses hip-hop music. For example, in his video for the song Congratulations, which I've also linked at the bottom. There are more examples that I haven't linked that I'm just going to go through right now. Iggy Azalea has kind of a double whammy in her music video for Black Widow, because she is appropriating hip-hop music and also a lot of Japanese imagery that's really not quite so accurately portrayed. It's really taking a key more from the Japanese action movie style, but she's also often known to use African American vernacular English in other songs, such as her song Fancy, which you can look up the video for if you wish. Miley Cyrus is a big example throughout her bangers era in around 2013, 2014, if you can remember, when she kind of shocked the world by coming out of her Disney girl kind of persona, and she came into appropriating hip-hop and Black dance, twerking, Black street fashion when she kind of wore that Bulls jersey as an underwear set, and again when she put on a grill at the beginning of the video for We Can't Stop. And finally, Ariana Grande. She capitalizes on ethnic ambiguity. She uses excessive self-tanner to the point where she is almost the same color as a Black artist that she works with quite often called Victoria Monet. And you can see that in her music video for Monopoly that they shot together. Ariana Grande's last name is also ambiguous and evocative of Latin American descent. She also uses hip-hop music and aesthetics and uses African American vernacular English, both in her Twitter and in her music. So again, you can look at the song Monopoly if you're interested in that. So there's a lot of examples going on. But the thing is, a lot of these white artists that go into hip-hop eventually go back. They leave hip-hop and kind of go back to their musical roots or whatever. For example, two of the artists on this list have done that. Kesha and Miley Cyrus have both left hip-hop, left the scene, and took their careers in a different direction. I think they both went back to country music. So they didn't really, when they did that, they weren't really thinking about the privilege that it takes to just kind of leave the hip-hop scene and go be able to go be successful in a different music genre. Of course, a lot of examples of American cultural appropriation are racial or ethnic appropriations, but queerbaiting is a LGBTQ plus appropriation, and you really can't ignore that either. So queerbaiting is the use of creating homoerotic subtext or using queer imagery for basically for shock value or as a means to gain support from queer fans. This can also include keeping your sexuality more ambiguous as a way of attracting queer fans without losing your straight fans who may disapprove of queerness. A very clear example of this is Katy Perry's song I Kissed a Girl. In 2008, she used the shock of this song basically to gain attention from audiences and that shock value, but she was providing a faux queer representation, especially when you consider that at the end of the music video, the video is full of girls, but at the end she is shown in bed with a man. She's also given mixed messages to her fans, Katy Perry has, on trying to explain her sexuality, saying that she has done more than kissed a girl, but she still only refers to herself as an ally. She never confirmed herself as bisexual or pansexual or whatever she personally identifies herself as. She has never really firmly identified herself to her fans. Another more current, more relevant example right now than Katy Perry is Ariana Grande. We're talking about her again because she's been vocal about her love for her LGBTQ fans. She's an outspoken queer advocate. But she has also used the lyric, I like women and men, in her song Monopoly, and had a near kiss with a woman at the end of her music video for Break Up With Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored. But when asked by her fans about her sexuality on Twitter, she essentially said she had never felt the need to label herself and wasn't going to start now. You know, you can't really fault anyone for purposefully rejecting labels, as it can be really freeing in a way for many members of the LGBTQ community to not have to define their sexuality. But it's also, you can't deny that it's also really frustrating for queer fans who have been sent these messages that supposedly confirm the queerness of an artist, but then the artist doesn't really want to confirm or deny anything. So I'm not trying to say that using cultural influences is inherently bad in pop music, especially because it's basically impossible to avoid in today's pop world. The bigger issue is using these references from other cultures without acknowledging your influences or without acknowledging the privilege necessary to effortlessly switch between cultures or between genres. And it does take a lot of privilege, so making sure that you're not stealing so much as you are honoring an artist, or making sure you're honoring your influences, and not just using other artists of color or other queer artists that pop artists are working with to kind of be a cosign for them to take whatever they want from a different culture. But, so does this cultural appropriation mean that we can't like or appreciate the music? No, of course it doesn't mean that. It's more about being a critical content consumer, because we can't really help if we like a style of music or not. That's silly. We're human, you know? We like what music we like. But we can be uncomfortable with the appropriation that a pop artist or any other artist portrays, but still acknowledge that they have a lot of talent and a lot of, great things that they can bring to the table as an artist. And of course, a similar approach can be taken with the opera examples I gave earlier, with the addition that keeping in mind that certain productions were products of their time. Back then it was acceptable to appropriate culture in that way. And it was part of their composer's compelling storyline. So you can still appreciate the, artistry of the music. So appropriation today, present in classical music, is mostly referring to young band and young choir repertoire. This is often seen in pieces centered around stereotypical elements from different cultures' music, such as using a pentatonic scale to stereotype Asian music, or the harmonic minor scale for Middle Eastern music, or drumming for African music. So, a composer who is trying to write a young band piece might take the harmonic minor scale, which goes like this. Bum 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 bum. Sorry, I'm not a great singer. But they might take that harmonic minor scale and say, that sounds Middle Eastern. I'm going to write a piece and call it Camel Ride. That's cultural appropriation. And that's really perpetuating that idea of the single story once again. But that happens quite often in young band repertoire because the composers just see it as a way to spread culture, when really it's inaccurate and it's bringing that single story. And these pieces are often given inappropriate descriptions and inappropriate titles that really cement those stereotypes. Other characteristics of these kinds of pieces, Africa is often treated like one country instead of the 54 separate nations that make up Africa, or when non-European or non-North American cultures are called exotic, they're exoticized, and it may be described as tribal or primitive. On the next slide, you'll see a couple examples of piece titles and descriptions for young band repertoire that you can buy right now if you wanted to from the well-known music website jwpepper.com. See the pieces Tribal Journeys, African Celebration, Africa Ceremony, Song and Ritual, and Reflections of Asia. And you can take a moment to read those, pause the voiceover, and go ahead and read those. Alright, on the next slide is how we can avoid cultural appropriation in the classroom. So first things first, to avoid cultural appropriation, the first thing is just try to choose authentic materials as often as possible. Consciously stay away from those pieces that are going to be stereotyping other cultures, and pick folk songs that are actually from the culture if you want to introduce more cultural diversity into younger music programs. So this piece, Hunting Scenes, was by a Japanese composer, and it is an actual authentic folk song. So that's a great, although it is a westernized, organized composition, it's a great way to introduce that to young band students by using more authentic materials, as you can read in the description, the program note. So once you have those authentic materials, you can discuss them as a class, the context and the intention of the piece, what it means to the other culture. Of course, include those detailed program notes when you perform it. So have that program and include the context so that the audience will also know the context. Give credit to the other culture for this song. And also just set a tone of respect in the classroom for other cultures, especially if you're teaching like a middle school band class. If you kind of set that tone with them right off the bat, then hopefully they'll be able to carry that with them through their high school career and beyond, to respect the music of other cultures and try to play it authentically. So the next slide is just some critiques that I had of this presentation. So these stages are not necessarily meant to be hard and fast. You can only do one at a time. It's really not going to help anyone if you just do one at a time, actually. It'd be more enriching to anybody's musical education to try to incorporate them. So really, variety in programming is the spice of life. It's good for everyone. Also, a lot of the pieces examining current issues are written with professional ensembles in mind. So finding materials can be difficult for a middle school or high school ensemble when we're talking about step 2 with those contemporary composers who are writing socially conscious pieces. So you may have to do a little bit of digging. They do exist. They're just a little harder to find than, say, pieces that aren't about social justice issues so much, like a Christmas piece. So this presentation is also mostly intended to address secondary music education classrooms, but these techniques could be adapted and applied for elementary music classrooms as well. And honestly, it's probably even better to start these conversations younger. More inclusive classes at a younger level will encourage more kids to try to stay in music and continue enriching their musical experiences with that social justice, critical consciousness kind of lens. Finally, this presentation did not discuss ableism in the music classroom, and I did that on purpose because that is a whole other can of worms, because a lot of it is outside of repertoire choices and needs to be handled on a case-by-case basis, making specific accommodations for each student that needs that. So I didn't want to pigeonhole anything quite so much. So no, I did not discuss issues of ableism in the music classroom. So let's wrap this up. Last slide, conclusions. The main idea here was to provide some house strategies for abolitionist music teaching. Since in our education prep courses we tend to get a lot of like what and a lot of theory, but not a lot of how to apply that theory. It's not, what I have here is not the end-all be-all of abolitionist teaching. There's a lot that you can, do on your own, come up with your own ideas. Highly encourage that, but just hopefully this can provide kind of a jumping-off place for you to think about some of these things in your future classrooms. Every idea here has been done in a real classroom, and many more ideas that I did not mention have been done in a real classroom. So anything that you can think of is probably possible. You can look it up and see if someone else has done it, and if not, you can use other examples as a starting spot. Of course, keep in mind the resources that are possible with whatever school or program that you're going to be going into, but there are a lot of possibilities that you will have to incorporate abolitionist teaching in your future. So if you have any questions or comments, please contact me to ask, or try posting a discussion thread. We can talk about it, because I'd love to learn from you about your ideas and experiences if you have anything to tell me. And thanks so much for bothering to listen to this. And if you want to look at the references, there are a bunch of slides with all the references, so enjoy.